There's a quiet hum in the background of every man's life, a ceaseless ticking, barely noticed until one day it screams. We call it time. We carve it up, sell it off, trade it for dollars and duties, convinced that's what it's for. We rise with it, work through it, fall exhausted into bed when it's done, only to start the whole damn cycle again. Most of us live our whole lives like this, seeing time as a simple measure, a commodity to be exchanged, an endless river that will always flow. We mistake activity for progress, busyness for fulfillment, and the promise of someday for a plan. But what if that river isn't endless at all? What if it's got a definite end, and every single drop you let go for nothing, every moment you give away without thought, is a drop you can never, ever get back? What if the real wealth isn't in what you earn, but in what you keep of that precious, irreplaceable flow? There was a man, a solid, decent man named Frank, who learned this truth not from some preacher or some self-help guru, but from the raw, unblinking glare of a life lived by the factory clock, until the clock just wasn't enough anymore. He learned that time wasn't just hours you sold for $1. It was everything. Frank, 46 years old, was a man forged in the heat and hum of a factory floor, a place where the air always tasted faintly of iron and effort. He'd spent the better part of 3 decades within those walls, navigating the clatter and roar of machinery that was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The clang of metal, the hiss of hydraulics, the low thrum of massive presses, these were the constant companions, the soundtrack to his existence. His frame, though not towering, was sturdy, built for endurance, like an old-growth tree that had weathered countless storms. He moved with a practiced economy, no wasted motion, every step, every lift, every turn of a wrench imbued with years of ingrained efficiency. His hands, the tools of his trade, told their own story. Even after a thorough scrubbing on a Sunday morning, when he was finally free of the day's grime, they bore the indelible marks of his life. Knuckles thick as river stones, lines etched deep as canyons across his palms from gripping tools and pushing metal, a faint, almost metallic sheen that never quite washed away. They were powerful hands, capable of intricate work or brute force, hands that had built and fixed, that had learned the silent language of steel and gears. They were the hands of a man who carried the weight of machines, and more often than not, the immense, unspoken weight of his family's world. His face, weathered by early mornings and late nights, by the subtle stress of making ends meet, held a permanent map of quiet resolve. Fine lines fanned out from the corners of his eyes, not from laughter, but from years of squinting at blueprints, inspecting precise welds under harsh lights, or simply gazing into the middle distance while his mind wrestled with numbers and responsibilities. Those eyes, a faded blue that once might have held a spark of youthful mischief, were now usually tired, carrying a heavy, watchful patience. They saw everything, missed little, an almost weary intelligence behind them, but rarely gave away the turbulent thoughts or quiet hopes they held inside. Frank wasn't one for small talk, not really. You wouldn't find him holding court in the break room, spinning yarns or cracking jokes. His words were as measured as his movements, few, but always meaningful, always direct. He was the guy you could always count on, though. If a conveyor belt seized up or a machine choked or a new kid struggled with a stubborn bolt, Frank would be there. He'd offer a silent nod, a steady hand to help lift a heavy component, or a quiet, concise instruction, his presence a calm, reliable force amidst the industrial chaos. He was solid, utterly dependable, like a good oak table in a bustling kitchen. But beneath that stoic, reliable surface, beneath the veneer of the man who simply showed up and did the work, you could feel the immense, unspoken burden he carried. He was a man defined by the work he did, by the relentless hours he put in, by the sheer, grinding effort of staying afloat in a world that demanded more and more. He was a man who understood the value of $1, because he knew exactly how many hours of his own life it took to earn it. Every movement was efficient, every gesture economical, born of a life where wasted motion meant wasted time, and wasted time meant lost wages. He was the very definition of a provider, a sentinel guarding his family's modest security, but somewhere along the way, he'd started to feel less like a guard and more like a prisoner, bound by the very demands he sought to fulfill. There's a particular kind of trap in this life, a quiet, insidious one that ain't got bars or locks, but holds a man tighter than any prison cell. It's the trap where you wake up before the sun every single day and trade your most precious, non-renewable resource, your actual living time, for a number on a pay stub. You trade the whisper of morning birds for the blare of an alarm, the warmth of your family for the cold, predictable hum of machinery. You tell yourself it's just for now, just to get by, just until the kids are grown, until the mortgage is paid, until retirement. But until is a ghost, ain't it? It's a horizon that keeps receding, a promise whispered by the clock that never quite delivers. It's a slow erosion, a steady drip, drip, drip of minutes and hours and days, each one slipping away, irreplaceable, gone forever. Traded for the illusion of security, for the fleeting comfort of enough, for the promise of a life you're perpetually too busy building to ever actually live. And the cruelest part, most men don't even see the invisible bars until they've forgotten what freedom tastes like, until the weight of the years has settled so deep in their shoulders, they can barely remember what it felt like to stand up straight and choose their own path. That was Frank Miller, 46 years old, and you could read his life story not in books, but in the deep grooves of his hands and the quiet fatigue in his eyes. He wasn't a man born to the factory, not really, but it had certainly become the crucible of his existence. He was built like an old-growth oak, solid and rooted, weathered by countless storms, standing firm against whatever the world threw his way, but showing the undeniable signs of the relentless wind and rain. He carried himself with the deliberate, almost heavy grace of a man who knew the precise weight of every tool, every component, every responsibility. His gait was steady, no wasted motion, each step a testament to efficiency learned over decades on unforgiving concrete floors. His work clothes, though clean, always seemed to hang on him with a familiar weariness, absorbing the sense of oil and metal that clung to him even after a shower. His face was a roadmap of hard-won wisdom and quiet endurance, etched with the subtle calligraphy of time and toil. Lines fanned out from the corners of his faded blue eyes, not from joy, not primarily, but from the constant squint against the harsh glare of assembly line lights, from the precise, unblinking focus demanded by repetitive tasks, from the unspoken worries that settled deep in his bones after a long shift. His jaw, perpetually set, spoke of a quiet determination, a man who wouldn't give up, couldn't give up, because there were others depending on him, their hopes and futures balanced precariously on his steady shoulders. But it was his hands that told the clearest, most visceral story of Frank Miller. These weren't the smooth, manicured hands of an office worker, nor the nimble digits of a craftsman. These were working man's hands, thick, scarred, the knuckles swollen and stiff, calluses like layers of armor across his palms. They'd lifted, gripped, hammered, tightened, adjusted, and repaired for decades, each scar a punctuation mark in a life of labor. You could feel the history in their texture, the ghost of 1,000 tools, the persistent hum of countless machines that had vibrated through bone and sinew. They were strong, still, capable, but they were also tired, perpetually tired, a living testament to every single dollar he'd ever earned. Each one paid for with a piece of his own flesh and blood and time, leaving behind a subtle ache that no amount of sleep could quite eradicate. His faded blue eyes, though often weary, held a startling depth. They saw everything, missed nothing, yet rarely betrayed the quiet desperation or the nascent ambition that often swirled beneath the surface of his stoic composure. They were the eyes of a sentinel, always watchful, always on guard, not just against machine malfunctions or safety hazards, but against the creeping anxieties of a life spent perpetually on the edge of just enough. He was a man defined by the clock-in, clock-out life, a quiet cog in a much larger machine, wondering, deep down, if there was ever a way to truly turn his own gears, to steer his own course, to reclaim the time that had become his most valuable, yet most traded commodity. The shrill bleating of the alarm clock, always too early, tore him from the shallow waters of sleep, 6 days a week, sometimes 7, 5 a.m. Frank knew that sound like he knew his own heartbeat, a mechanical pulse that signaled the start of another day's grind. He'd swing his feet to the cold linoleum, the phantom ache of the previous day's labor already a dull throb in his lower back. He moved through the house like a ghost, a practiced ballet of silence, coffee brewing, the morning news a murmur he barely registered from the living room. A quick shower, the hot water a fleeting luxury that did little to wash away the deeper fatigue. Then the weight of his work boots, each lace pulled tight, a small ritual of preparing for battle. Before the sun had even thought about peeking over the suburban rooftops, Frank was already out the door, the chill morning air a crisp slap to his face. The drive to the plant was a blur of familiar landmarks, streetlights painting stripes across his windshield. The same route day in, day out. He'd pull into the vast, half-empty parking lot, the skeletal silhouettes of the factory rising against the paling sky like some ancient, metallic beast. Inside, the smell of hydraulic fluid, metal dust, and stale coffee was a perfume he'd worn for decades. His station, a small island in a sea of whirring gears and clanking presses, awaited him. His work was methodical, repetitive. The feeding of parts, the pressing of buttons, the monitoring of gauges, the endless cycle of assembly. Each action precise, practiced, muscle memory doing most of the heavy lifting while his mind drifted, often to the quiet hum of worries that never truly shut off. He was good at it, efficient, reliable. He could assemble a component in his sleep and often felt like he was. Time at the factory wasn't lived, it was spent. Traded, hour for dollar, a transaction that left him feeling perpetually depleted. Every paycheck, hard-earned and gritty, felt less like an achievement and more like a temporary bandage. There was always another bill, another expense waiting in the wings. The mortgage on the modest, slightly dated house, a roof over their heads, but one that always seemed to need a repair. Sarah's car, getting older by the day. Emily's college fund, a monstrous beast that swallowed every spare dime. David's school trips, a new pair of cleats, the constant growth of a boy turning into a young man. The numbers never quite added up, always a little short, always requiring another hour, another Saturday shift, another piece of his dwindling time to make ends meet. It was a treadmill he ran on, full speed, just to stay in the same damn place. But beneath the surface of this quiet endurance, a deeper current churned. Frank carried within him the ghosts of dreams long deferred, ambitions neatly tucked away like old blueprints in a dusty drawer. He'd once envisioned a different path for himself. Not grandiose, not a CEO, but something more his own. He'd tinkered with engines in his youth, always loved the satisfaction of building, of creating something tangible from scratch. There was a time when he thought about opening his own small garage, a place where he could work with his hands, solve mechanical puzzles, be his own boss. That young man, full of spark and grease-stained hope, felt like a stranger now, a character from a story he'd once started but never finished. What haunted Frank most wasn't just the endless cycle of work and bills, but the insidious fear of stagnation. He watched younger guys come into the plant, fresh-faced and eager, and he saw the slow, inevitable dimming of their eyes over the years. Was that his fate? To watch life pass by from behind a chain-link fence, the roar of machines drowning out the whisper of his own potential. He feared becoming invisible, just another cog, not just to the company, but to his own kids. He wanted them to see a father who wasn't just a provider, but a man who lived, who grew, who had choices. A quiet desperation had taken root in him, a feeling that his life was not truly his own. He was living a life, yes, but was it his? His days were dictated by the shift schedule, his energy consumed by the demands of the line, his free moments nibbled away by obligations. The cruel irony was that he spent his entire existence earning time, trading precious hours for dollars, but never truly owning it. It was always on loan, always owed to someone else. The bank, the factory, the relentless procession of bills that materialized like clockwork. And in the silent hours before dawn, or the exhausted moments after his family was asleep, Frank often found himself grappling with a profound, unspoken question. What was all this time for if not to live? It was a Saturday, a rarity in Frank's life when the hum of the factory machinery didn't demand his presence. This Saturday, though, wasn't for rest. It was for David. His son's team, the Hornets, had clawed their way into the Little League championship game. David, at 13, was blossoming on the pitcher's mound, a quiet intensity in his eyes that mirrored a younger Frank, before the world had started to sand down his edges. Frank had promised David he'd be there, no matter what. He'd even taken the day off weeks ago, marked it with a big red circle on the kitchen calendar. He was just about to head out, the faint scent of Sarah's coffee still lingering in the air, David already bouncing by the door with his glove when his phone buzzed. It was Gary, his supervisor. "Frank, listen, I know it's your day off, but we got a major fault on line 3. We need all hands. Mandatory overtime. 4 hours right now." Frank felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. "Gary, I can't. It's David's championship game. I promised him." Gary's voice, though sympathetic, was firm. "Frank, you know how it is. If we don't get this fixed, we're looking at a full shutdown. And you know what that means for paychecks next week. Company S on our ass. Overtime's time and a half, man. Think of the extra cash. Extra cash." The words hung in the air, a siren song Frank knew intimately. Sarah had mentioned the fridge needed replacing. Emily was eyeing a college application fee that felt like a king's ransom. He looked at David, who had stopped bouncing, his youthful radar picking up on the shift in Frank's energy. The hopeful spark in his son's eyes flickered. "All right, Gary," Frank said, the words tasting like ash. "I'll be there." He tried to explain it to David, to Sarah. He used the usual lines. "It's important. We need the money. Daddy wishes he could be there." Sarah just nodded, a familiar weariness etched around her eyes. David's shoulders slumped, a small, involuntary movement that spoke volumes. "It's okay, Dad," he mumbled, but his voice was thin, reedy. It was okay. Frank knew it, and David knew he knew it. The drive to the factory felt like a funeral procession. Every mile away from the baseball field was a nail hammered into his own coffin of regret. The smell of oil and sweat usually brought a grim satisfaction, the scent of honest work. Today, it was the stench of compromise, of a life traded away hour by hour. He worked the shift with a dull resentment, his hands moving automatically, his mind replaying David's slumped shoulders. He imagined the cheers, the crack of the bat, the tension of the final inning. Each wrench turned, each bolt tightened, felt like a desperate attempt to buy back what he was losing, knowing full well it was impossible. He got home hours later, the house quiet, dark. The clock on the microwave glowed 9:47 p.m. He peeled off his work boots, the scent of the factory clinging to him. Sarah met him in the kitchen, her voice soft, but her eyes held a brightness he didn't recognize. "He did it, Frank," she whispered, a proud smile blooming on her face. "David pitched a no-hitter in the last 2 innings, struck out their best batter for the final out. They won the championship. He was MVP." The words hit Frank with the force of a physical blow. No-hitter, MVP, his son, and he hadn't been there. He saw David's triumphant grin in his mind's eye, a moment that would live in the boy's memory forever, a moment Frank had willingly, foolishly, traded for 4 hours of mandatory overtime. The extra money in his pocket suddenly felt like a heavy, worthless burden. It couldn't buy back the sight of his son's joy, the shared glance of pride, the memory of that winning pitch. It couldn't buy back a single, solitary second of that game. He went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The numbers on the digital clock glowed an accusatory red. 1:37 a.m., then 2:03 a.m., then 3:11 a.m. Finally, he gave up, swinging his legs out of bed. The floorboards creaked softly under his bare feet as he padded down to the kitchen, the only room in the house that felt large enough for the weight pressing down on him. He poured himself a glass of water, the silence of the house amplifying the frantic pounding of his own heart. He sat at the kitchen table, the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through the window, painting stark shadows on the walls. What had his life become? He had spent the day tightening bolts, earning money to replace a fridge, to pay for college applications, to keep the bills from piling up. All necessary, all responsible. But what about the cost? The true cost, measured not in dollars and cents, but in the echoes of a son's unheard triumph. He pictured the empty seat in the stands where he should have been. It wasn't just a seat, it was a gaping hole. A hole in David's memory of his father's presence. A hole in Frank's own soul. He thought of the young man he once was, the one with the grease-stained hope, the one who dreamt of more than just surviving. That man wouldn't have missed that game. That man would have found a way. He was a provider, yes, a protector. But at what point did providing turn into merely selling himself, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for himself, or for those he was supposedly providing for? His time, his most precious, non-renewable asset, was being sold off, cheap like a worn-out tool. He was a wage slave, all right, not just to the factory, but to the endless pursuit of just enough. His whole life he'd believed time was a currency, something you exchanged for wages. The more you worked, the more you earned, the better life you could provide. But tonight, that belief had shattered. He'd earned extra, yes, but he'd lost something infinitely more valuable. He had traded a priceless memory for a few extra dollars, and there was no refund, no exchange, no amount of money that could ever buy it back. The realization hit him with a cold, clear force that cut through years of ingrained thinking. He wasn't just losing time, he was losing life. His life. And the lives of those he loved, moments he'd never reclaim. He stared into the darkness, the silence of 3 a.m. pressing down, forcing him to confront the brutal truth. He had allowed himself to become a pawn, his choices dictated by the immediate demands of his job and the relentless pressure of bills. He had bought into the lie that his time wasn't his own, that it was merely a commodity to be sold. And the price? It was higher than he had ever imagined. It was David's championship game. And how many more championship games, how many more precious moments was he willing to miss before he truly woke up? The thought was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. He had to stop. This couldn't be his life. It just couldn't. He had to stop. This couldn't be his life. It just couldn't. The declaration wasn't spoken, not even whispered, but it resonated with a force that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the house. It was a quiet, enough. Not an angry shout, not a desperate plea, but a solid, immutable boundary drawn in the darkness. Frank didn't have a plan. He didn't know what came next or how he was going to change things. He only knew with a certainty that chilled him and yet also brought a strange, fragile warmth that he couldn't keep going down this road. The weight of his own silent acceptance of years traded away felt like a physical burden lifting just a fraction. He had to reclaim what was his. The alarm shrilled at 5 a.m., old habit, but this morning it felt different, not just a call to arms but a challenge. He lay there for a beat longer than usual, letting the sound just hang in the air, a symbol of the time he had once so readily surrendered. He heard Sarah stirring, the faint clinking of a spoon in a mug in the kitchen. Then his phone buzzed. It was Gary from the plant. "Hey, Frank, we got a busted line on the press. Need an extra hand ASAP." Mandatory overtime again. Frank's gut tightened. Old Frank would have been halfway out the door already, grabbing a banana, mentally calculating the extra hours, the extra dollars. Old Frank would have felt the familiar surge of duty, the undeniable pull of providing. But new Frank, the one forged in the raw fire of 3 a.m. despair, felt something else. He felt a fierce, protective instinct. This wasn't just another shift. This was his morning. This was his choice. A deep breath. "Gary," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "I can't make it today. I've got other commitments." He heard the surprise, then the mild annoyance in Gary's reply, but Frank held firm. He didn't elaborate. He didn't apologize. He simply stood his ground. The line went dead. He felt a tremor, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. It was the hardest thing he'd done in years, saying no to the factory, to the extra money, to the expectation. It felt like walking away from a deep-seated belief, a core part of his identity. But as he hung up, a different sensation bloomed in his chest. Freedom, a small, terrifying, utterly real freedom. He had just bought himself time. He had just made his first investment. That first morning felt longer, heavier than any triple shift he'd ever worked. He didn't go back to bed. He didn't pace. He just stood there, the receiver still warm in his hand, looking out the window at the pre-dawn gray. What was he supposed to do now? The alarm still hadn't gone off, but his body, a loyal soldier to routine, felt the phantom urge to move, to prepare. He heard Sarah come into the living room, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Everything all right, Frank? Who was that?" she asked, her voice soft with early morning concern. He turned, the words catching in his throat. It was Gary. "They wanted me in for overtime. I told him no." Sarah blinked, then her eyebrows furrowed slightly. "No, but we could use the extra hours, honey. Is everything okay?" It wasn't an accusation, just genuine worry, a reflection of their shared reality. He nodded, a tight knot forming in his stomach. "It's fine, Sarah. It's just, I couldn't." He couldn't articulate the raw, unpolished truth of his 3 a.m. revelation yet. Not to her. Not when it still felt so fragile, so terrifyingly new. He didn't know what to do with his time that morning. He usually wolfed down breakfast, grabbed his lunch, and was out the door. Now he sat at the kitchen table with Sarah, watching her sip her coffee, feeling a strange blend of peace and profound unease. David came down, still sleepy-eyed, surprised to see his dad not in uniform. "Dad, aren't you going to work?" "Not this morning, buddy," Frank said, trying to make his voice light, trying to ignore the frantic beat of his own heart. "Thought I'd have breakfast with you guys." It was awkward. Emily, usually up before dawn studying, emerged later, equally surprised. He poured himself a second cup of coffee, then a third, the routine of clocking in, the comforting grind, conspicuously absent. He tried to help Sarah with the dishes, puttered in the garage, fixed a leaky faucet he'd been meaning to get to for months. Each small task felt like a victory, yet also like a betrayal of the clock-in, clock-out rhythm that had defined his adult life. The silence, usually a luxury, felt like a void. The ghost of lost wages whispered in his ear. Day 3 was harder. The exhilaration had faded, replaced by a dull ache of uncertainty. The factory, with all its demands, at least provided a clear purpose. Now, the blank canvas of his reclaimed time felt daunting. He saw an email from a former coworker, a handyman business he ran on weekends. "Need an extra pair of hands for a decking job Saturday, Frank?" Cash under the table. The old reflex fired. Money, quick, easy money, just a Saturday. He typed out a reply, "Maybe," then stared at it. This is how it starts again, he thought. One job, then another until it's not my time, it's theirs. He deleted the email and turned off his phone. His hand trembled. It felt like tearing a bandage off an old wound. By the end of the first week, the battle was constant. His body still wanted to wake at 4:50 a.m., his mind still raced with the efficiency needed to make it to the plant. He'd committed to being home more, but what did that mean? He felt like a visitor in his own house sometimes, a silent sentinel watching his family move through their lives. He offered to help Emily with her calculus, but she politely declined, already having a study group. He suggested a board game with David, who was deep in a video game world and barely grunted in response. The moments he craved, the deep connections, weren't materializing on command. One evening, after the kids were in bed, he found himself on the couch, mindlessly flipping through channels, a beer in his hand. Sarah was reading a book beside him. He wasn't connecting with her, wasn't doing anything productive or fulfilling. He was just there, the same old escape, just now without the crushing exhaustion. He felt a wave of profound guilt and frustration. Is this it? Is this what I fought for? To sit here and feel useless? The thought was a venomous whisper, tempting him to call Gary, to apologize, to return to the comfortable, albeit suffocating, routine. He could make the money back. He could tell himself he was providing. He could go back to not having to think about time, just sell it. He almost did it. He felt the familiar weight of his phone in his palm, his thumb hovering over Gary's contact. The image of David's face, tear-streaked and confused in the bleachers, flashed in his mind. The sting of the memory was fresh, sharp. No, his grip tightened on the phone, not to call, but to hold firm. He didn't want to just be home, he wanted to be present. He put the phone down, then set the beer on the coffee table. "Sarah," he said, her name sounding foreign, unpracticed. She looked up, surprised. "What are you reading?" She smiled, a slow, real smile that reached her eyes. "Oh, just a novel. It's about a woman who leaves her old life behind to travel." He leaned in, truly listening for the first time in years. They talked for an hour about her book, about his day, about nothing and everything. It wasn't the dramatic breakthrough he'd imagined, no grand epiphany, but in that quiet, shared space, a different kind of investment was made. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was real. He had battled the urge to retreat, to fall back into old patterns, and for that moment he had won. The war for his time wasn't over, but he was learning how to fight. Days turned into weeks. Frank didn't quit his job. Not yet. Not entirely. But something fundamental had shifted within him, like a tectonic plate grinding into a new position. He still woke at 5 a.m., still smelled the metallic tang of the factory floor, still punched the clock. Only now the time outside the factory gates started to hold a different, almost sacred weight. He began saying no to the odd Saturday shift Gary would try to entice him with, politely but firmly. At first, Gary ribbed him. "What, got a hot date, Frank?" "Never pegged you for a social butterfly, mister. Overtime king." Frank just shrugged, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. He wasn't avoiding work. He was choosing where to invest his most precious, non-renewable asset. He started small.